Bienvenidas y bienvenidos. Seguimos con las Jornadas Monetarias y Bancarias 2020 del Banco Central de la República Argentina. Mi nombre es Germán Feldman, soy economista jefe del banco. En esta actividad participa también Ariel Dvoskin, gerente principal de estudios económicos. Estamos abriendo el tercer panel de las jornadas que se titula Políticas macroeconómicas en la era del COVID-19. La primera expositora es la profesora María Cristina Marcuzzo de la Universidad La Sapienza, que va a estar discutiendo acerca de las políticas de austeridad y la visión de Keynes. María Cristina Marcuzzo es profesora honoraria de Economía de la Universidad de Roma La Sapienza y miembro de la Academia de Lincei. Es expresidenta de la Sociedad Europea de Historia del Pensamiento Económico y de la Sociedad Italiana de Historia de la Economía Política y profesora invitada en varias universidades de Europa, Japón, México y Estados Unidos. Ha trabajado en la teoría monetaria clásica, la Escuela de Cambridge, la economía keynesiana y más recientemente sobre las inversiones de Keynes en mercados financieros. Ha publicado alrededor de 100 artículos en revistas y libros, además de escribir o editar 20 volúmenes. So, Cristina, the time is yours.
Thank you very much, Germán. It is a pity I cannot be with you as I were some years ago, but that's what the situation is like, and I'm glad for the invitation. So the title of my talk is What is Wrong with Austerity Policy? Lessons from John Maynard Keynes. So what I would like to start with is to say that one of the good side of the many bad side of the COVID-19 situation is that it had made possible to lift some of the austerity measures which have been pursued since the 2008. That's particularly true in Europe, but also in other countries. So now we see that some expansionary fiscal and monetary policy are being put in place, but the economic theory behind the austerity approach and the balanced budget approach to growth has not been discarded. So we just observe some temporary lifting of this policy, but not the idea behind it, which are still dominant among economists. And in fact, it is very clear that the lifting of this austerity policy is presented as temporary. Just recently, a few days ago, Jens Weidmann, the president of the German Central Bank, warned about the risk of creating the impression that the debt of the European Union level somehow doesn't count. So he said the recovery fund, which is the fund which is being put in place to address the issue, lifting the austerity approach, he said should remain a clearly defined crisis measure and should not open the door to permanent European Union debt. So what we observe is that the plea by several heterodox economists of different schools, not just Keynesians, Marxists, generally heterodox schools, who have been preaching the necessity of rejecting austerity policies, these pleas are being only partially recognized as appropriate. So in the meanwhile, whatever as opposition as endorsement, Keynes' work remains the main reference of the argument in favor or against austerity policy. From the early 70s, Keynesian economic bashings has become common in academic and wider circles, discarding Keynesian as nonsense, basically. And it was not just the work of neoclassical economists like Friedman and Lucas, but also Austrian school and public choice school, particularly Buchanan. All this gained a great influence in the last, 10, 15 years. And this was helped by the fact that many journalists and other conservative public intellectuals, they helped to construct a neoliberal ideology, which was based on laissez-faire ideas and on a kind of mathematical economics, which seems to offer the scientific legitimacy to the new cradle. So it was a combination of media support and technical support coming from the econometrics and mathematical economics. So in the last, I would say, 15, 20 years, the whole set of ideas and policies geared to reducing the size of the state apparatus and deregulating markets, in particular financial market. They conquer academia, they conquer institutions, and they conquer the media. So I think that the austerity approach may be seen as the outcome of an anti-Keynesian counter-revolution. Okay, we know Keynesian revolution, this austerity policy can be seen as a counter-revolution target to Keynesian economics. What are the claims? What is the idea behind this? Well, I think there is a faith, not much evidence, that fiscal rectitude promotes confidence, prompt increased consumption, investment, and growth. Why do I call it faith? Well, because as I said, it seems to be linked to the so-called best economic literature. And this literature, as I just said, gained consensus against Keynesian economics. Why? Because Keynesian economics was thought to be guilty of fiscal profligacy and on top of it, incapable of tackle the crisis because it didn't have the right economic theory to deal with it. So what I do in this talk, I will not revise the evidence, which is very controversial, but I'll try to show which were the Keynes argument in their original form, not the way in which they came to us in the travesty of the free market proponents, or in the distorted image of several versions of the neoclassical synthesis, post-Keynesian, neo-Keynesians, and so forth. So I hope that by showing what was Keynes' original message, we discover that what he really thought about fiscal discipline is not what is often attributed to him. So Keynes was not the prophet of fiscal imbalances. He saw the government budget as a constraint, not an objective of policy. He recognized the importance of budgetary balance, of course, in terms of confidence and expectations, but that was not the priority. Okay? He saw that there was a problem if you run in too high deficit, because this might influence confidence and expectation, but that was never the priority, especially in times of crisis. He was certainly in favor of some market intervention. In particular, he thought that exclusive reliance on market mechanism was faulty. But what perhaps is not always understood is that Keynes was really a liberal. He gave great importance to market incentive to sustain aggregate demand and employment. He was certainly not in favor of having the state ruling the economy. So I think that if we want to put in a nutshell what was the message, I would say that he was, using his word, stabilizing business confidence. And it was only when private investment was failing, then the government was thought the government should step in prevent high unemployment and general distress. So the priority was try to build confidence, and confidence can be built in various ways, through institutions, through a good governance, to a lot of things. And that was the message. That's what the state should be in charge of doing. So I'll try to give you some quotations to prove this point, and then I will try to draw some methodological aspect of Keynes economics, which I hope may give further support to the anti-austerity cause. Okay, so now I would like to give you some evidence of the continuity of Keynes' thinking before the general theory, during the general theory, and after the general theory on these points. Even before the general theory, Keynes had many scathing comments on the prevailing attitude against deficit spending. And I think that this applies very nicely to today's defenders of the austerity programs. So in 1934, he wrote, "The man who regards all this, namely loan finance public works, particularly as public expenditure on housing, as a senseless extravagance which will impoverish the nation as compared with doing nothing and leaving millions unemployed, should be recognized for as a lunatic." Okay, so the idea that you prefer to live unemployed rather than making public expenditure, he said this is just ridiculous. And he always stood for seeking measure to make use of either resources. When we have unemployed men and unemployed plant and more savings that we are using at home, it is utterly imbecile to say that we cannot afford these things. For it is with an unemployed plant and with nothing else that these things are done. To have labor and cement and steel and machinery and transport laying by, and to say that we cannot afford to embark on harbor work or whatever it may be, is the delirium of mental confusion. So I think this would apply even to their argument. And in the general theory, of course, I would like to stress the point that the general theory is not a plea for deficit spending, as some anti-Keynesian wanted us to believe. Look at Buchanan. The legacy or heritage of Lord Keynes is political bias towards spending, deficit spending, inflation, and the growth of government. This is what, they're talking about already in the 70s. On the contrary, Keynes clearly said in the general theory, if the state is able to determine the aggregate amount of resources devoted to augmenting the instruments and the basis rate of reward to those who own them, it will have accomplished all that is necessary. As you can see, the role of the state is very much focused on a very restricted ground. So again, as I said, the policy message of the general theory is to sustain the level of investment, but this should not be interpreted as just having debt finance public work. These are needed only when the private system, the private investor, do not come forward, providing a sufficient level of aggregate demand. So the central point of the general theory is not finance spending, but the idea that it is investment with determined savings via change in income, and not the other way around, as the logic of the anti-Keynesian argument would have. So if the level of investment is kept high by injecting government expenditure when the private sector is not forthcoming, then income and saving increase. And of course, also the size of government deficit is reduced. No? When you increase your government spending, you are on the way of making possible a reduction in government deficit, not in its augmentation. Keynes loved paradoxes, and the famous proposal of digging holes in the ground was meant, as John Robinson reminded us, to penetrate the thick walls of obscurantism of the old laissez-faire orthodoxy. I mean, he made the suggestion that the treasury should bury bottles filled with banknotes and then let the private individual lease the ground, dig out the bottle, pocket the money, and spend it. This is clearly a paradox, the idea that every operation, the idea that he was opposed to, that every operation should make a full profit or not be done at all. So what is the central point here? That it does not matter how public money is spent as long as it is spent, since it will generate income and through the multiplier, the savings necessary to finance the initial expenditure. This is meant to illustrate the principle, not to suggest that money should be wasted in a strange project. Keynes said clearly it would much be better to build houses and things like that. But if there are political and practical difficulties in the way of this, the above, namely the paradox of burying the bottle, would be better than nothing. And even after the general theory, Keynes was very clear that in a slump, unlike in the boom, the size of the government should not be the major concern. When you are in a slump, when you are in a crisis, you should not prioritize the deficit, unlike what happens in a boom. And in 1944, he wrote very clearly, it would be a failure to adopt a remedy for several cyclical unemployment, which may have the effect to unstabilize the national budget, since measures to stabilize the national income are ipso facto measures to stabilize the national budget. And he continued, addressing the committee that was doubtful about this proposition. The committee gave the impression that whilst the measures they propose to avoid unemployment are admittedly necessary and advisable, a price has to pay for them in the shape of budgetary deficits and perhaps a consequent weakening in international confidence in our position. Exactly the opposite is the truth. It would be a failure to take such measures, which would inevitably unstabilize the budget and weaken confidence. It is supposed the slumps increase the national wealth. So reliance on market mechanism will not be enough in a crisis. In the midst of the economic and social effects of the COVID-19, we know, unfortunately, the forecasts are now a dramatic fall in GDP around the world, creating mass unemployment, stagnation, and poverty. If we still believe that market mechanism will do the trick, especially tackling the issue of increasing inequality that this crisis has brought with it, we would make a big mistake again. What is needed is coordinated action to stimulate aggregate demand, to address social economics inequality, remove structural imbalances, and promote sustainable growth. Obviously, it is a very ambitious program which requires international cooperation and political stability. So I think that the threat, as the German central bank said, that remember, we need to repay the debt that are incurred during this pandemia. I think that this threat will not help to undertake this necessary measure. So I conclude, this is a nice picture, not very well known, is in a private archives of Keynes. I think that the lesson to be learned is quoting a passage from How to Pay for the War, in which Keynes calls upon the leader of opinion in all parties to propose a plan conceived in the spirit of social justice, a plan which uses a time of general sacrifice, not as an excuse for postponing desirable reform, but as an opportunity for moving further than we have moved hitherto towards reducing inequality.
Thank you very much, Professor Marcuzzo, for this very interesting presentation. We will now take some minutes to make a couple of questions. We know that when the crisis started, among the set of policy responses, there's been a rise of public expenditure. Part of the response to the crisis has been expansionary fiscal policies. Right now, in different international forums like the G20, some of the discussions are around when is the right time to reduce the fiscal stimulus package. So, of course, what you have just said is very relevant in order to start discussing if not only the timing, but also the size of the fiscal response, and of course how to think about the post-pandemic world. So my question would be, first, how do you see the current fiscal response, if it has been enough or not? And regarding this, I think, and the degree of coordination of these policies, if the problem has been that the size or the lack of enough coordination, and how are the discussions now in Europe regarding fiscal policy in the post-pandemic world?
Well, of course, I can speak only over Europe, which the situation I know. And so I wouldn't know much about United States or South America or Asia, for that matter. So first of all, I think that what we have experienced so far, it has been a sort of lag of response, because there's been a lot of promises, a lot of arguments, a lot of discussion, but the money has not arrived as yet. So that's the first problem. And now we heard that there is a lot of vetoes within the European community. I think that some of the northern countries, or just Poland and so forth, are putting a lot of conditions. I think that Angela Merkel was the one who tried to, to push the matter further, and van der Leyen as well. She seems to be very well willing, but the machinery of the European Union is a very complex machinery. And I'm afraid that will take some time before they're talking now. We won't get any money until the spring 2021, if we get any money. And they started with 250 billion, and now they're half of it that has been spoken of. But I think that what is more important to my mind, on the basis of what I said about Keynes, and as far as Italy, for instance, is concerned, we have been giving money in a way that I'm not sure is very helpful. People have been given some pocket money to everybody, 600 euros and one time. So we are encouraging consumption rather than promoting investment. And I think this is, which might have been right in the immediacy of the crisis, namely in March, April. That's okay, because some people honestly couldn't go on because everything was closed, especially restaurants, bars, and so on. But now we have to start thinking in terms of investment, not in terms of consumption, because that's when the situation will improve. If so it's the composition of expenditure that matters, not just the size. And what I fear will happen is that when the situation hopefully will be over by the end of 2021, European Maastricht rules will not be changed. First of all, because politically it's very difficult to change them. As I said at the beginning, they are just lifted for a moment. And have you seen what the German guy said? Don't believe that you don't have to go back to the previous situation. So my hope is that the whole architecture of a European Union may change as a result of it. But I'm not sure that politically it's feasible, especially since Angela Merkel will leave and the next guy will come. I'm not sure it will be so pro, intervention as she has been. So that's for, and then of course the situation in the United States is very worrying. With, it's not clear what the election will bring, whether the situation with China will improve or not. So this international cooperation, which is needed to address a lot of problems, is not forthcoming at the moment. So that's what I think.
Hi, Professor Marcuzzo.
Hi, Ariel. How are you?
Fine, thank you. Thank you very much for your very nice presentation. Let me ask you, well, something which is really interesting about Keynes is that as you know, he departs, as you just said, from neoclassical theory because he realizes somehow that it is investment that determines savings and not the other way around. But what is perhaps fascinating about Keynes is that he cannot break with neoclassical thinking. And he was struggling in the general theory. You can sense, you can touch with your hands that he's struggling with this tension. So my question is, what would you think, if we could speculate, what would you think would be his suggestion, his policy prescriptions to deal with the current crisis? Would he insist on demand side policies? Would he be concerned with some supply side constraints that may emerge because we have a lockdown, for instance, that necessarily creates some supply side constraints? So would he be so, I mean, pragmatical, if you want, pragmatic in his way of thinking as he was in the general theory? What would you think?
Well, unfortunately, we have an example of what he thought in How to Pay for the War, because we can consider the COVID-19 very similar to a war in the sense that we have a lot of supply constraints, as you rightly said. And the question is that's what I insist of international cooperation. You know, during the war, especially Britain organized, a supply chain, organized a lot of things together with the Commonwealth and with the allies in order to make sure that the supply of goods and services was forthcoming for the war purposes. So just to give you an idea of the problem, at the beginning of the lockdown, there was a tremendous shortage of masks. You know, in Europe, you couldn't find masks because the only supplier of masks were the Chinese. And so we had a tremendous problem to find masks because there was not enough, and we had to go through China. There was also these problems of having and so forth. So what happens? The government persuaded that it was also in the interest of some private individual, especially in the garment section. So a lot of garments factories start producing masks. And because the government gave incentive to that and so on. So, I mean, if the government is taking the situation in hand, it's not just directing aggregate demand, it's just trying to make sure that the supply of needed goods are forthcoming. And this is the problem of what we have had with globalization. You know, the small items are all produced by China. You know, you couldn't find things because a mask is a very cheap thing. You know, nobody find it profitable to produce mask. And unless so the government intervene to make sure that the supply chain is directed for the common goods, that of course it will take time, but it will happen. And exactly as in the war, you know, exactly as in a war. But again, it is require international cooperation and perhaps a new idea of a division of labors among nations. China will not be very happy about it, because if we move some low-cost production outside China and so on, this might create other problems. So I don't see a solution unless there is honestly some international cooperation. I just, I am a fellow of the Accademia dei Lincei. By the way, there was also, so I participate in my function as foreign secretary to the S20, which is the conference of all the academy of the countries which participated to the G20. That was done in Saudi Arabia this year. And a lot of the discussion was precisely that, how we can induce intellectuals and economists and people in the health sector to rethink the way in which the supply of fundamental goods are provided. And the vaccine should be an example of this international cooperation rather than a race who gets first there. And the vaccine case, against COVID-19 is a typical example of a needed international cooperation. Remember at the beginning when Trump wanted to buy all the license of the vaccine and say America will be the one who will have it. And then this, of course, I think Germany response was, no, this is, if we are providing the vaccine, it will be available to everybody. So I think as in a war, this COVID-19 should teach us international cooperation. There's no other way out. And within each country, try to direct some of the production, not just delocalize them, but try to have at least the most important item, something that you can produce yourself.
Cristina, let me make you a last question. As you have just said in your presentation, it seems that the expansionary policy that has been implemented up to now have not been caused by theoretical conviction, but they were more like a matter of necessity. So my question would be, do you think that this crisis might have some impact on theoretical thinking and the kind, the way policymakers approach economic policy, or we will go back to the old normality?
Well, it's hard to say. I certainly believe that there need to be a change in the institutional framework in which economists are promoted. I mean, if in order to get a tenure position, you have to publish an article every 4 months, and then it has to be quoted, and the citation, and so on. We are entering a serious problem of adverse selection. Rather than promoting better science, we are promoting bad science. So I don't see that this change will come as a change of idea, even if obviously some changes are likely to happen. But if the institutional setup of university and international institution are still based on the same mechanism, promoting those who manage to have more citations or something like that, that is likely to put us back in the same situation. So I hope, even with this university which are closed, a new form of teaching is developed, a new form of doing research is done, because now we don't go to conferences any longer. So that sociological aspect of the profession may change. And this is where I think that the modification may occur, not just because people learn on the COVID. I don't think so.
Okay.
Perhaps I'm pessimistic. And anyway, there is always a new generation coming up. I don't trust my generation. Maybe yours is better. Let's hope so.
Okay. Well,
Okay.
thank you very much again.
Thank you to you. I'm very sorry I can't come to Buenos Aires because I had the marvelous memories of Alvear, of the seeing you, and so I do hope that there will be a chance of either you coming to Rome or myself going back to Buenos Aires.
Okay, I hope so.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Okay, thank you very much. Bye-bye.